Okay, what we're going to look at in this video is arcade emulation on the Raspberry Pi. Now, there's a lot of different ways of doing this on the Raspberry Pi, different emulators, different configurations, but what I'm going to do is give you an overview of all of them, but go into detail on one of them. So, as you can see in the background, it's pretty straightforward once you have got it configured, and it'll run arcade games quite happily. Obviously, as arcade games developed over the years, they became more and more advanced, so typically the newer ones either won't be emulated or they might run a bit slower or not be quite as effective as some of the older games. But by and large, you can run a lot of the old arcade games. So like you see in the background, we've got Galaga 88 running, no problems at all with that, and I've got much newer games running pretty well as well. So what we're going to do is just go over how I've configured this, and I have not configured very much out of the stock install of RetroPie at all. This is based on RetroPie, but you could just get the individual emulator and run it on the Raspberry Pi if you wanted. But it's quite often easier because using a package like RetroPie, it's got everything pre-configured to a large degree and can be quick and easy to set up. So this is running on RetroPie 2.6.0, but you'll see as you go through the instructions, a lot of it is easily applicable to different versions, so don't worry too much if you're not running the latest, but quite often it's better to use the new image or use the new version just to keep up to date with the new binaries. I haven't done anything to this Raspberry Pi at all other than create the or write the 2.6.0 image to it, and I've got a separate video on how the basics are, how you start with that and how you write that. Separately, I've expanded the card so it's using all of the available disk space, and I've set the overclock to a standard 1000 MHz. This is a Raspberry Pi 2, but you'll find that the vast majority of the arcade emulation will run fine on a B+, the sort of previous series of the Raspberry Pi. So don't worry too much if you haven't got the latest Pi, it's not going to make a massive difference at the moment. Besides that, that's all I've done to it. I've just copied the ROMs across, and that's what's running it. So there's not an awful lot of steps that I have to go over. Now, there are quite a lot of people who've got questions about arcade emulation or MAME emulation, because it is a bit different to a lot of the other systems, particularly the ones that run under RetroArch. So for example, when you run a MAME emulator or an arcade emulator, typically it won't be using RetroArch, so you have to get controls configured differently. For example, you can see Galaga running in the background. If I want to configure my joypad to this, obviously I've plugged it into the Pi, but then on the keyboard, and you'd want the keyboard plugged in the first time when you configure this, because the default set of keys are set for a keyboard, and it's a quick and easy way to configure everything. If you press tab like that, you'll see up on the screen the options. And mainly the only one you'll ever have to worry about is this first one, input general, and you can set all your keys in here. You can see there's a lot of pre-configured options that are available there to set your controller. I've got a separate video on this, so if you need more detail just check that out, but basically you can see this is where you set the controllers, not in the RetroArch file, because as you'll see, most of it won't apply to this. Okay. Now I know a lot of the feedback on the videos is sometimes I start a bit basic and go through everything, but so what I've done now is in the comments I'll put a link to a forum post that's got all the relevant key bits of detail, so you can just scan down that and find the bits you want. But what I'm going to try and do in the video is for beginners, particularly to emulation, because it's becoming much more popular. I'm going to try and start from getting the basic Pi to playing the game, so you should be able to follow these steps and get it up and running. Like I said, all I've got at the moment is a standard image of 2.6.0, and there's one image if you've got a Raspberry Pi 1 and a separate image for a Raspberry Pi 2, so just make sure you write the right image. And that's it, besides setting the overclock, although it probably run for the most part okay without the overclock, resizing the card and copying the ROMs across. And as you can see, do bear in mind that typically you are going to get a different way of setting up your keys using this tab button on the keyboard to get into that area. And there are other ways of emulating arcade games or MAME on a Raspberry Pi, but I'm not going to cover all of those in depth because the video would just be hours long. What we're going to do is show probably the most popular version, which is MAME for all. Now MAME, you might have heard that phrase a lot, it stands for Multiple Arcade Machine Emulator, and it's probably the most popular program to emulate arcade games out there. So, and it runs on PC and various other platforms. But for the Raspberry Pi, there's a version of this that's got optimized for the Raspberry Pi. So it's not MAME on a Raspberry Pi, it's a version of MAME that follows it pretty closely, but it's geared to the hardware on a Raspberry Pi. It's called MAME for all Pi, and I'll put the links in the details so you can go and check that out. But it does come pre-installed and configured with RetroPie, so you can just install the RetroPie image and start writing it. What we'll do, just to give you a quick overview of what's going to follow, is I'll go into the Raspberry Pi command line, so I'll use PuTTY to remotely access that. I'll show you the different ways that the Raspberry Pi can emulate arcade games, or the different emulators it can use, so you can see there's more than one option. And then we'll go into detail on how to do this for MAME for all, which has recently been updated with a few small changes, so it looks like it's getting a bit more development as well, which could be a good thing. I'll also show you briefly how MAME ROMs work, or the principle behind the ROMs, because that quite often can trip people up when they're trying to get arcade emulation running. But like I say, it's not often as simple as having one file and that's just going to run it. So it's it's a useful troubleshooting point to get you over any issues you might find, really. And then after that, all you should need to do, find your ROM set and be away. I'm not going to link to any ROMs because we can't do that, and also please don't ask me to link to any ROMs because I can't send that. So I'm sure you'll find on Google, if you need to get a particular ROM or ROM set, you can find those out, whether it's a torrent or an NZB file on Usenet or a website, whatever. They're out there. Can't link to those on the descriptions. Okay, what we'll do now is log into Raspberry Pi. You can do this either directly on the TV, or you can get an internet network connection to your Raspberry Pi, and you can connect to it with something like PuTTY. And when you get the ROMs to it, you could copy something using like an FTP client to copy them over. Again, separate videos for all that, so we won't go into detail on that. If you haven't got any sort of connection on the Pi at all, you could get ROMs across using the ROM copy service. And again, there's a separate video to detail that. So by one way or another, you can get your ROMs across. But I'm going to use a PuTTY to show you how to do that. Okay, as I mentioned, there are different ways to get arcade emulation working on the Raspberry Pi. I'm on a Raspberry Pi 2 here, and you can tell that with the V7 or the ARM7 up here. I think Raspberry Pi, the first series, it's say ARM6, but you don't really need that much oomph to run a lot of the games. So if I change the directory, we're going to go to the RetroPie directory, and then in there, if I change to ROMs and list that directory, you can see the pre-configured folders for ROMs on all of the systems, and you can see there are various ways that you could put, or various places you could put ROMs for arcade games. And as I look down the list here, you've got FBA, Final Burn Alpha, and libretro, which is putting it through RetroArch effectively. We've got MAME, which is the default folder for MAME for all, and that is the one this video is going to show you. So that's quite a key folder there, MAME. We've got MAME-add for MAME, which is advanced MAME, again a different MAME emulator. I'm not going to go in detail of all of these, like I said, it would just drag the video out, so we're going to focus on MAME. MAME artwork, which is a subfolder that MAME will use. It's not required, you don't have to put some artwork in there. Same for MAME samples, that also is read by MAME for all. You don't have to put files in there. I think MAME samples are a set of WAV files where the emulation couldn't get the sound ROM properly, so it's like manually putting in the sound for those. But again, they're kind of optional, they won't affect you too much. You've got MAME libretro, which is putting MAME for all through the RetroArch interface again. But typically, I mean, it depends on what you're trying to achieve with it, but you'll find, I'd say, the best success, certainly with the older games, up to about 2000 with MAME, and that's again what we're going to run for. Glancing down here, we've got Neo Geo, which is, whilst it's not strictly arcade game. It's SNK ROMs. It's just really a subset of arcade games. It's just for SNK Neo Geo. So you've got if you put them in there, we'll check in a minute, but that would run the SNK or Neo Geo ROMs using Final Burn Alpha. So it's like a subset of these really. And then you've got Neo Geo GNGO, which would just run the SNK ROMs with the emulator that's GNGO. And I've had quite a good success rate with GNGO. It seems to be better at running SNK ROMs than maybe Final Burn Alpha, but you might find your own experience different, and maybe in separate videos I'll show those emulators in more detail. And I think that might be about it. But when you're running RetroPie, you might be on 2.6.0 like this one, or you might be on a different version. And a good way to tell how you can run your ROMs is to look at the emulation station file, emulation station being the interface that you use to load the game. And that has a configuration file that shows you all the systems that it can be aware of. And to look at that, all we've got to do is change directory to /etc/emulation station. And in there, there's a file called essystems.cfg. So we're going to edit that with nano. Well, we're going to just read it, but nano, the text editor, will let us read that. So nano es_systems.cfg. Okay, you can see that there. And it's got a structure there. You can see each section showing each different emulator. We've got MAME, Atari 800, Apple Macintosh, Amstrad, and it's just got the full set. And what this is useful for is just confirming exactly what it would do when you put certain files in certain places. So for example, at the top here, the first one it's got listed is MAME, Advanced MAME, ADV MAME. And you can see here the path is really useful. It says if you go to the RetroPie folder, ROMs, and then in MAME-ADV MAME, if you put your ROMs in there, that is the emulator that's going to run it, Advanced MAME. And specifically on the command line, it'll show you exactly what it runs. The first section is kind of like a precursor to opening the ROM, and it sets video modes and things like that, so you can largely sort of ignore that bit. But then here we've got it runs in the folder OPT RetroPie emulators ADV MAME bin for binary, and then it runs Advanced MAME here. So we can see it doesn't go through RetroArch, and this is specifically the program it uses. And then if we scroll across to the right, it just basically runs that and passes the ROM name to it. So it's a good way of double checking that. Now I'm just going to search in this file with Control W, and at the bottom it says what I want to search for, and I want to see another one here. So I know a path for one is ROMs, so I've got down the bottom there ROMs/MAME. So it's jumped down the file. And again, it's called MAME, so I'll get the same graphical view on Emulation Station, that sort of blue MAME font. But if I put some ROMs in here and some ROMs in ADV MAME, for example, and they're both named MAME, then the font would appear the same twice. So you could be difficult to make sure you're going in the one you think you're going in, if that makes sense. Anyway, so here you can see that MAME, the one we're going to use, this is MAME for all, is going to use, it's going to read zip files, so your ROMs have to be in a zip file. Putting them separately isn't going to help. And my terminology here, well, I'm no MAME expert by any stretch of imagination, but a ROM is effectively a software dump of some information that was on a PCB board. And in a given game, you might have, I don't know, 8 ROMs, 10 ROMs, or 5 ROMs, like just at multiple separate ROM files. Some might do graphics, some might handle the sound, but you'll quite often get more than one, which is a reason why zip files are quite helpful. They just compress all that into one single file rather than having a stack load of files all over the disk, all over your hard disk. So those files are called ROMs. And when you've got a game that uses, say, 6 of them, it's put together in a single zip file, and that's called a ROM set. So you've got, on a given installation, you could have hundreds of ROM sets. And with MAME, it's useful to know that each version of MAME that comes out, and again, we're not using MAME the MAME program here, we're using a version of it, which is MAME for all in this instance. And for each version, they're quite particular about having the right ROM set. And when I say right ROM set, let's say there's a game like Gallagher, and in 1999 they ripped the PCB board and got five ROMs off it. They might find a few years later they could get more ROMs off it to improve the emulation. Maybe another sound file came off it and the sound was improved. So over time, ROM sets for an individual game can and do change. So when you see people say, oh, it's the 0.139 ROM set or the 0.042 ROM set, it's just relevant because certain versions of MAME will only run those certain version of the ROM sets. So bit of an aside there, but basically you can't just get a ROM for a game and expect it to definitely work. It must be the version that matches. And as I said about MAME for all, which we're looking at here, the Pi version of that is similar in that it needs a certain ROM set, and that ROM set that it needs is 0.37B5 or beta 5. So if you see that ROM set 0.37B5, it's very likely to work absolutely fine with this version. If it's later than that or earlier than that, it may well not. There's a chance it could work because it might not have changed since that version. It could be exactly the same file, but if it has changed, you're going to get problems. So getting the right ROM set version is really, really important. You do want to watch out for that. And the 0.37B5 set came out, or was sort of set in 2000, so that's about 15 years old now. So it's got a whole load of games, about 2,200 or 2,200 ROM sets anyway, up to 2000, which is obviously still quite a lot, but then it's also missing everything from that point up. So when you have that ROM set, don't expect it to have all of the games. Different emulators like Advanced MAME use a newer ROM set, so you're going to get more games emulated in that. It's just something to bear in mind, really. So anyway, back to MAME for all, which is this section here, and you can see on the command it runs again. It's got the video command there, and it runs under RetroPie folder, emulators, MAME for all. MAME is the binary it runs. It passes the ROM name to it, and that's it. Yeah, it just confirms that it's not running a RetroArch version or FBA or anything else. So to use that emulator, this is where you need to put the ROMs: RetroPie, ROMs, MAME. Just make sure they all go in there. And like I say, with that 0.37B5 set, I think it's 2,200 odd files. So if you've got, if you just put 5 files up there, it's very unlikely it's going to work, because a lot of the files rely on other files being there, and I'll show you an example of that in a minute. I'm not saying you have to put up the whole ROM set, but if you do miss some files, it's a reason why some of the games that rely on those files might not run. If you've got the full ROM set, you're looking at about 2,200 zip files, and it takes about 1.8 gig, give or take. It's that sort of size. Okay, right, now you see an example of here of how the different MAME emulators appear. I'll just do another one whilst we're here. If I Control W, let's have a look at FBA, and I know if you're going to use Final Burn Alpha, the folder you want to look for is, if I look for ROMs, I'm just typing down the bottom here at the moment, ROMs/FBA. Okay, so there it is, Final Burn Alpha. It's got the name of FBA, and the ROM folder is RetroPie ROMs FBA. Now I can't remember off the top of my head the ROM set versions that this one uses, but I'll put it in the notes, and if I do a separate video, no doubt I'll get some detail there. And this will happily run, again, zip files or FBA extension. And you can see here, to run Final Burn Alpha, it goes again into emulators, Pi FBA, FBA, 2 times there. Okay, so you get the idea. You run through this file and it'll show you which files would go where for which emulator. But the one we're going to do is MAME for all. Okay, quit out of that with Control X. Right, now we'll have a look at the folder locations for MAME for all. As we saw earlier, up here we've got the MAME folder. That's where we're going to put the ROMs. And if I just quickly go into that folder, change back to the MAME folder, and in there the red text is a compressed file, so that's a zip, and I'm not sure how to get a count on this. I've forgotten how to do that, but you know, it's just a folder full of zip files. Most of them are pretty small because a lot of arcade games pre-2000 weren't all that big, so you'll see quite a lot of small files to get on the different games there. And what we do is check out the paths for MAME for all. The binary that actually runs the game is in OPT, RetroPie, Emulators, MAME for all, so you can change directory into that. You don't need to do this, it's just a bit more information about how it's working really. And in that folder you can see we've got various files. We've got the MAME executable itself, which is MAME for all. You've got this file here called CLR MAME.dat, and that effectively tells another program, whichever one you might want to use, exactly what version of files it's looking for. And there's a good wiki post that I'll link up to that a user's written, and it explains how to use that file to check your ROM set is correct. So if you're not sure, if you've got a load of ROM sets and you're not sure which version they are, by using CLR MAME.dat, you can verify if they're the correct version. It's really quite useful. It can look a bit complicated, the interface to check this, but once you've done it a couple of times, it's pretty easy to scan through and check. And then once you've done it, you don't have to do it again. You know you've got the version you're after. Like I said, this is the MAME for all. We've got a README here, which I'll just open now, and you can see some basic detail about how this MAME for all came about. So nano readme.txt. So you can see here this MAME for all by a user called Squid. This is a MAME Raspberry Pi port based on the original MAME for all, which is itself based on MAME 0.37b5. So you can see, whilst it's not a release of MAME, it is a variant of that's developed for the Raspberry Pi. And this README, it's worth having a look through because it's got some decent information on some default keys that the system would be expecting. And I think down here there's some information on the config file that you can change as well. We'll look at that in a second, but it's just useful to explain what the directories do. I'll have a quick review of that in a second anyway. Okay, it's a pretty short file. It doesn't go on. It's got a bit of the history, and I think in this README it goes up to September 2013. In the very recent update to this MAME for all, there's a very small couple of changes for 2015, so this isn't the absolute latest, but you're not missing out on any functionality. It's the same, so don't worry about that. Okay, so that's the README. Now what we are going to look at is this next file here, mame.cfg. This is effectively like the retroarch.cfg. It's the main configuration file for MAME for all. So in here, there aren't that many settings. You've got some various ones here. I don't think I change any of these usually, to be honest. There's one, I think there's border somewhere. It's in the README file. It says something about a border change, but I'm not seeing that at the moment. Just have a quick search for border. Oh, there it is. Display border. So if it definitely used to be a bit of a common issue where you'd run a MAME game and it just wouldn't, it would go off the screen, it wouldn't fit properly, and display border just brings it in a bit. So if you're finding that the display is going off the screen, if you put something like display border underscore border equals 10, 12 there, it just brings it back in to fit all properly on the screen. So it's an option to change that, but I don't change any of these other ones here. The directories, this is telling MAME for all where it should look for some extra directories, and you've got the INP folder there, which I think we're going to check out in a minute. I think this is the one you can record some sort of mini gameplay videos, and it puts it in there. I think that's what that one is. NVRAM is really quite useful on some games. The NVRAM is effectively like, I think it stands for non-volatile RAM, so it's like the BIOS, the bit that won't get overwritten when you turn the machine off. So to emulate that, it writes it to a file, and it would write it in this folder. And you can access that. I think I'm right in saying it's F2 on games that have NVRAM. particularly I know some cave shooters, and the options you get in there are things like you can set difficulty, you can set how many lives you get for a credit, that sort of thing. But one really useful setting in there is when a game runs, say, upside down, there's an option in there to just flip it up. I don't know necessarily why some of them run upside down. There's not very many that do. There's some cave shooters games that do. Is it Don Don Pachi? I think that one runs upside down for some reason. But if you press F2, there's an option to flip it around, F2 to quit out and save of it, and then it reboots and you're away. So it's just the folder where it's going to write those files. And you can see it's in the main config folder as well, which you probably use for some other settings, and you've seen that one before. So in RetroPie configs, there's a MAME folder, and the MAME folder relates to MAME for all. It doesn't relate to advanced MAME or MAME for all that runs under RetroArch or FBA or anything. This is the folder that it's after, and it's got the NVRAM subfolder there. You've got high, which is high scores, CFG, which is saves things like control settings, controllers. So unlike RetroArch, where you've got a text view and you can manually edit the text, in MAME for all, it's got its menu that you saw earlier by pressing tab, and when it saves your controller settings, it saves it in its own file, which I think is called mame.cfg, and it'd be found in this folder. But you can't read it with the text editor. It's in its own sort of custom binary format. The only way to edit it is to use the interface in the game itself. I think I'm right in saying you could delete that if you cock it up and you won't need to do it again. You could delete that file and it would recreate it when you press tab again in the game. But that's where it should appear, and that's what the mame.cfg in this folder here is used for. Snap, I guess that's for screenshots you can play in game. I think that memcard for the ones that support memory card. I guess there's a folder for that. STA, which is save states. I haven't tried those out, but obviously if you save your game halfway through, that's the folder that they're going to appear in, so you can check there that they're saving okay. Artwork, we saw that briefly in the ROMs folder earlier, which is there are some games again that MAME for all in 0.37b5 can't emulate perfectly, so the artwork folder I think has some sort of static images that it uses for certain overlays. There aren't very many games that supports that. It's only like, I don't know, 10 or 20 or something in there, so don't worry about not putting MAME artwork files there. I don't know anything about the cheat section really. ROM path, we saw that earlier. That's HomePie, RetroPie, ROMs, MAME. That's where it's looking for its ROMs. So if you ran your MAME ROMs off a USB device or something like that, this is certainly what you'd want to change. I don't think it supports multiple paths, but maybe you could try sticking a semicolon or comma at the end and trying, but it probably doesn't. It's just the one path there. But you can quite easily change that to wherever your USB drive is. Personally, I keep them all on the SD card and it seems quite happy, but that's up to you. And sample path, I can't remember. Oh yeah, MAME samples, that's WAV files, so music files for certain games that where the ROM hasn't been able to be ripped maybe, or dumped from the PCB board, so it can't emulate it because it hasn't done it yet, so they just manually put WAV files for some games in there. But again, I wouldn't worry if you haven't got the samples for that. You're not going to be missing an awful lot. And then it's just got the keyboard confirmed, which we saw earlier on the README file, so you don't need to worry too much about that. And joystick controls front end only. And again, I think I read that if it's not in this version, previously, or the newer version of MAME for all has defaulted to an Xbox 360 controller, so start select and these axes would map to an Xbox 360 controller. But it doesn't really matter if your controller doesn't work straight off the bat, just press tab and configure your keys like in the MAME control video. Anyway, that is the mame.cfg file. That is in, I'll just quit out of that with Control X. That is in OPT, RetroPie, emulators, MAME for all. So that was the configuration file, which is quite useful to change. And the last folder we're going to check out is the configuration of that, which we saw in the mame.cfg, but we'll just see where it is here. So cd opt /RetroPie /configs /MAME, and in there we've got those folders that we just saw. So if I go into the CFG, if I'd configured, oh, I have earlier, I forgot, yeah. So you've got the default.cfg, that would contain the controller settings that you configured, and I've also got individual configurations for games. Now I haven't configured in these separate controllers because I just set, well, I want my controller to work the same in all of the arcade games, but you could do it for individual games if you want. And I'm not sure what the other settings in a particular game file would be, but you can see in the main menu, when you press tab, you've got options to do that. Now the reason that you can't just tweak these manually is if I try and edit one, you'll see if I go for the default, it's, you know, you're not going to be able to edit that manually, and that's correct. That's to be expected. To edit these, you use the interface in MAME itself, and that's in this directory here, opt retropie configs MAME cfg. And that is largely it for configuration. Now I haven't changed anything, so you don't have to change anything here, but it's useful to know where MAME for all sets its settings, and this is MAME for all for the Pi. It gets a bit confusing. There's MAME, variants of it, forks of it, MAME for all, but basically MAME for all on the Pi, this version runs a lot of the games really well. Certainly everything that's included in its ROM set of 0.37 beta 5. And what I'll do as well in the forum, I'll put a link to, I've got a file where, or link to a file that details all of the ROMs that come with 37B5. So you'll see what is included, what isn't, and quite how they work. And one thing that's quite useful is, I haven't mentioned this yet, but another reason why a lot of ROMs might not work sometimes is because they haven't got all the files they need. And what I mean by that is, it's particular, MAME does this a lot. I think maybe some other emulators do it, but MAME arcade game ROMs do this a lot, where you've got a master game and you've got a clone game. And a master game is usually the first game of its type that gets released. Like for example, I think there's a master game called Pac-Man, but there's a clone of Pac-Man called Pac-Man, and obviously Pac-Man's vastly more well known. But if you try to play Pac-Man without having the ROM set for Pac-Man, it won't work. It'll error. It'll say it can't find all its files. And I'll show you an example. Okay, so here's an example of that master clone game relationship. You might also hear the term parent and child as well, but basically every ROM set that's out there is either standalone and it just uses the ROMs in its ROM set, or it also needs a master game. So here's an example. You've got 1941J ROM set, which is Japan, requires the master game of 1941, and you can see that the J version, it's got about 1, 2, 3, 4 files here of its own, but all the rest just exist in 1941, and not just exist in that, they require them for this version to run. So another example I think I've got is Kicker. There we go. Okay, so in Kicker you can see that Kicker itself has got 12 ROM files in its ROM set. But if you were to play Shaolin, while Shaolin has got some of the same, it uses some of the same files, it's got 2 of its own. So if I open the Shaolin ROM set, you can see here it's got just those 2 files. And we've got here, over here, those 2, Shaolin.6, Shaolin.7, which are these 2 files here. That's all the ROM set has. The rest, it's got to find a Kicker. If Kicker isn't there in the same directory, it's not going to run. And I can open Kicker to show that. Here we go. There we go, we've got Kicker, and it's got the 12 files here. And as long as that exists, Shaolin will run. Now, because Kicker is the master game, it can run on its own. You'd only need that file and it would be okay. But it just goes to show that you do need, quite often, the various extra ROMs. Whilst you don't have to have them all installed on the card, if you're going to run anything that needs a master game, you've obviously got to have that master game as well. So you can see there's definite requirement and dependency on quite a lot of ROMs to have that information available. This file again I'll link to in the forum or description, because it shows for 0.37b5 all of the master and clone game relationships going on there. As you can see, some of them are quite in-depth, some of them have got various clones of that master. I mean, this isn't even necessarily that extensive. Some of them got like 8, 9, 10 different clones of a particular game, and it's just something that can easily catch you out why a game might not be working, because you've got the right ROM set but it still doesn't work because it needs to find the master ROM set in the same directory as well. So just make sure that all that's in place. Okay. Now, just in case you're not fed up enough with me talking about ROM sets and versions, to just go over that again, we're using MAME for all here for Pi. It uses ROM set 0.37b5. If you don't have that ROM set, very unlikely to work. If you don't have the master or parent ROMs for the ROM you're trying to run, it won't work. And but there is a way that not only can you sort of verify if you've got the right ROM set, also if you haven't got the right ROM set, how you can potentially rebuild it. Because as you saw a moment ago, in a given ROM set you've got various ROMs, and it could well be the case that a previous a previous and future version of that ROM set could be amalgamated to give you the correct ROM set. And again, the tools that I linked to allow you to rebuild your ROM sets to a particular version. So you can, although it's a bit more of a long-winded, bit more complicated way, build your own valid 0.37b5 ROM set if you've got other sets that contain the right file somewhere, because a program can scan through. And a popular one is CLR MAME Pro. If you search for that, you'll see a sort of separate page for that, and it's quite an advanced tool to manage ROM sets and sort of generally deal with how they're held. And another one is called Rom Center. Again, I'll put a few links for this up. And what they'll do, they'll scan through all your ROM sets and say, okay, I've got all that information, and you say, right, I want to build 0.37b5, and that's what that that's what this file here would tell CLR MAME Pro. It tells it exactly what versions are valid for it, and then the program will spit out a new set of ROMs, a new set of ROM sets that are correct, so you can sort of rebuild it. Obviously, it's a lot easier if you can just find the original ones in the first place and use those, but it's another option. And what we do next is that, because that covers all of the configuration, it shows you which folder you've got to put your ROMs into, and if you want, you can change the configuration in MAME for all using that mame.cfg. After that, it's really just down to you to configure your joypad or whatever your controller is to get MAME for all to see it, because by default it's unlikely to. It's not like RetroArch where there's a stack of predefined auto sort of configurations. You've got to do it with the tab section. So I'll fire up into that now. Okay, here we are in Gradius 3, and at the moment I've not configured my joypad, which is a USB iBuffalo. I'm pressing all the buttons and I'm getting nowhere on it. It's not configured to recognise it at all. So I've got to have a keyboard plugged in the first time. I'm going to press tab on that, and you can see you get the main menu up there on MAME for all. And I don't want to put my controller specific to a particular game, so I'm going to use input general. And one of the key options I'm interested in is getting back to emulation station, so getting an easy quit out. At the moment, I've just popped in there and set escape or joystick 1 button 6, joystick 1 button 7 to do it. So if I was to blank that out and press enter and then escape, so at the moment I wouldn't be able to escape out of a UI. So I'm going to add, first I'll press enter, and then I'm going to hold select and tap start on my joypad, but I do it really quickly, and you should see how that's set. There we go. So to cancel out of a UI, it's hold down select, press start. Mine happens to be button 6 and 7, so it would do that, but I also want escape to work, so I'm going to press enter and tap escape. And you you can see now it's added escape, so I can either do the J1, joystick 1, button 6, joystick 1, button 7, which is start and select, or press escape. So if I do that now, start and select, then I go back to that, and if I do it again, back to the main menu. If I did it again, I would go back to Emulation Station. So anyway, I'm going back in with Tab, and input General. Okay, so we've got the quit, which is useful. Another useful one is Player 1 Start, so I'm going to press Enter there and press Start. That's my Start button, because that's what I want to do. I want to keep the game. Then we've got coins, so for credits, I'm going to put that to my Select button, so Enter and Select. There we go. And here we go, Player 1. Now I think this might be alright for my controller. Up, down, left, right might work, so I'm going to leave that. Player 1, button 1, I've got J1, button 0, which is probably wrong for me, or left control, but either way, I'm going to... Okay, there we go, oh, it's 0. Button 2, B, button 3, X, and button 4, I'll have Y. Okay, so I've done my, well, I think I've done my up, down, left, right, because I think the one it's got there is fine. And I've done A, B, X, Y. Oh, I did just press something there. Hang on. That was button 4, which was Y before. Let's change that. There we go, yeah. So it's joy button 0, 1, 2, 3 for my 4 buttons. And I could use the shoulder buttons I've got, but I'll leave that for a minute. So I'll quit out of this with Start Select. Oh. And put credits in with Select. There we go, I've got credits at the top of the screen. And press Start to Start. And yeah, that's the option I want. And see what buttons. Okay, my up, down, left, right is working. That's not doing anything, that's sheeting. So that button. What's that? Okay, so A's sheet, and I'm not sure what's going to change. I think you get the gist from how I've configured these. I just want to see if the other 3 buttons do anything. Yeah, you might get bored at this point, but hang on. Okay, okay, that X did. I think I applied a speed power up. So they are all getting used. This is the problem, it takes me a while to do videos because I'll start them and get distracted by them. But there we go, so that's speed, apply that, gone faster but still die. Okay, yeah, that's the controller, so quit out of that, Start Select. And one thing I have just thought of is it's useful to have a reset button. Because quite often you might just want to quit the game and get back to the start screen rather than back to Emulation Station itself. So to get that up, if you press Tab and go to Input General, under Input General you've got the option here for Reset Games. If I press Enter there, I'm going to choose say a shoulder button on my USB pad, right button there, and there you go, it's got J1, joy button 5. So if I escape out of that, or select Start out of that, and again select Start out of that, and press Select. Okay, I can tell my buttons are working. It's going okay, and if I decide I want to get back to the main title screen, all I've got to do is hit the right shoulder button. So I'll tap that now. There we go, and it boots back to the start. And that's it really. I think we followed it from right at the start, getting your ROMs on there in the right directory, and that should be everything you need in order to get arcade games playing. It's really just a case of remembering, use the right ROM set, put it in the right folder, and make sure you've got the relevant parent or master ROM sets there, and that's it, it should work fine. There are plenty of other emulators, like we saw earlier, that you can use to emulate the arcade games on a Raspberry Pi. If there's enough demand, I'll do another video on how to configure one of those up. So this isn't the only route, there are some other options. And many of those other options use personally, I find that this is fine. It's pretty much got everything pre-2000. There's plenty of choice there, but yeah, you can play newer games if you want. If there are any comments you've got or questions, put them in the forum link or the comments on the YouTube video. If it was useful to you, please click the thumbs up button, the like button, just to let other people know that it's going to be useful for them. And I think that's everything. Thanks.